Good evening, I am Emma Vaughan-Jones, and tonight on From the Frontline I have with me in the studio Dr. Peter Hammond. Good evening, Mr. Hammond.
Evening, Emma.
So, we've had some very interesting revolutionary anniversaries recently. Last Sunday marked the 230th anniversary of the launch of the French Revolution. Many people all over the world, some in France, now recently over the weekend, have all been celebrating this Bastille Day. So, what is Bastille Day?
Well, with Bastille Day, they're trying to commemorate the launch of the French Revolution with what's become pretty much more myth and legend than reality, because the storming of the Bastille, which is a medieval fortress that was long past its actual effectiveness, it was a very out-of-date fortress for the technology of the time, and in it was actually not a single political prisoner. Although they like to say they were storming it to free all the prisoners, there were only 7 criminals in there. There was not a single political prisoner in the Bastille, which makes that not quite as nice as the narrative, but we shouldn't let facts get in the way of a good story kind of attitude.
Absolutely not.
And then also what makes it less than heroic is to realize that the governor of the Bastille, Monsieur de Launay, had negotiated under flag of truce to surrender the Bastille on condition that he and his men would be allowed to go free without any harm. And that was agreed on, and under the white flag of truce, they were all tortured, butchered, beheaded, and the heads carried on pikes. The soldiers who defended, who'd handed it over under flag of truce, and the governor who they had assured safe conduct and all this. So that's pretty treacherous and disgusting, and what do you want to celebrate? But that sort of reminds one that Soweto Day, or what they call Youth Day in South Africa, 16 June, the first person to die was a Catholic missionary on the streets of Soweto who was hacked to death and killed and eaten on the sidewalks in Soweto, and a whole lot of other people who dedicate their lives to helping local people, which doesn't fit with a narrative. So let's sort of forget these facts generally. And this is what revolutions often are. Revolutions promise heaven, deliver hell. They never actually deliver what they promise. And that's why revolutions always become more and more violent, cannibalistic even. And in the case of the French Revolution, what are we celebrating? 40,000 people beheaded, 2/3 of which were common people. So this idea that, it was just the nobles, as though that they don't count, were being beheaded. Men, women, children, grey-haired, grandparents being beheaded. But some of them were, as documented by Charles Dickens in Tale of Two Cities, even a seamstress had done absolutely nothing wrong to anyone. And this kind of bloodlust. And it wasn't just the 40,000 people guillotined. There was another 300,000 killed by firing squads and by the mass drownings and other forms of massacres. So it then led to 25 years of war in which over 6 million people were killed in these revolutionary wars across Europe. So I don't think the Bastille Day is anything worth celebrating. And I don't know why anyone in Franschhoek would celebrate it, because Franschhoek was founded by the Protestant Huguenots who fled Catholic persecution in France 100 years before the French Revolution. 1688 they established Franschhoek, what used to be Franschhoek, and none of their ancestors would have been part of the revolution. And it just seems bizarre why people who are the heirs of great Protestant reformers would want to support some antichrist, secular humanist, atheist revolution, which Karl Marx says is the gold standard for all revolutions. So a bit bizarre, but yes, that's one of the reasons why we didn't celebrate Bastille Day.
Sure, absolutely. That sounds rightly horrific. So that doesn't sound like anything to be celebrating, but rather somberly mourning. So that
Indeed.
Definitely blows my mind.
There's an interesting anecdote to this. Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady, the British Prime Minister back in 1989, she was invited to Paris for the G7 conference over July 1989 for the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. And so the G7, that's the 7 largest economies on earth, those countries' leaders came to Paris for this very symbolic moment to celebrate the myth and legend of how wonderful the French Revolution was meant to be. Well, Margaret Thatcher, being a very sharp woman, she chose a very appropriate gift. She gave the French president, Francois Mitterrand, who, by the way, was a member of the Communist Party. She gave Francois Mitterrand a leather-bound first edition of Charles Dickens' immortal book, A Tale of Two Cities. A Tale of Two Cities is a tale of Paris and London during the time of the French Revolution. And it's Charles Dickens' great work where he contrasts London with Paris, the fruit of the great evangelical awakening of Whitefield and Wesley in London, and the terrible secular humanist Renaissance revolution in France and the Reign of Terror. That's in Paris. So the opening words of this drama, Tale of Two Cities, some of the most famous opening words of any book, instantly recognizable. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was an age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. And this contrast between Christianity and communism is dramatically presented throughout A Tale of Two Cities. The fruit of the Protestant Reformation, the great evangelical awakening in London, was wisdom, faith, light, hope, and joy. But the fruit of the anti-God, radical, secular, humanist, revolutionary fanaticism that triumphed in France in 1789 was the worst of times and an age of foolishness, unbelief, darkness, despair, and misery. Just as 2 Peter 2 verse 19 says, they promised them freedom while they themselves are slaves of depravity. So, as Margaret Thatcher made this very symbolic historic gift on this historic date, the journalists flocked around her and said, what are your impressions of the French Revolution? Margaret Thatcher said, well, it resulted in a lot of headless corpses and a tyrant. Well, that wasn't what they wanted to hear, and she turned to Francois Mitterrand and said, read A Tale of Two Cities and learn why the French Revolution was completely unnecessary.
Sure.
Now, you can imagine that's like blasphemy, treason, and heresy to the New World Order and the French revolutionaries. But Margaret Thatcher had a sense of this momentous event, and I think her symbolic act of resistance was as historic as that anniversary they were marking.
Absolutely. Sure, that's awesome. That's absolutely incredible. I wonder if he ever did end up reading it.
Well, maybe curiosity led him to read some of it, but it's a great book. And if you want a good film in it, there have been a lot of film renditions, but I found most of the recent ones got the heart and soul out of it. But the 1935, which is open on the public domain, the Ronald Coleman 1935 version, it begins with scripture, it ends with scripture, it's God-honoring, Christ-centered, it's faithful to Charles Dickens. It's a mega, massive epic, cast of thousands. It's just spectacular and extraordinary. They could make films like that in 1935. But I would recommend, if you want to see a film, it'll make you want to read the book, because there's obviously more in the book. But it's a great film. It's a great book, A Tale of Two Cities. I think anyone who reads A Tale of Two Cities or watches the 1935 film will be cured of wanting to celebrate the French Revolution.
Yes, and cured to support communism.
Yes. Oh, a book I should recommend is Robespierre by Otto Scott. Inside the French Revolution. Robespierre, Inside the French Revolution. That's the best book of the French Revolution that I've ever read.
Where can people find
Christian Liberty Books has got stocks. Admin at christianlibertybooks.co.za or www.christianlibertybooks.co.za. Yes, A Tale of Two Cities. Absolute classic, and I think the film's in the public domain.
Awesome. Great. Well, definitely I have to have a look and a read. But another one of these revolutionary anniversaries that is coming up in a couple of days' time is Mandela Day, which is going to be celebrating 101 years since the birth of Mandela on the 18th. So shall we be celebrating this? How or what are your views?
I'm not going to be celebrating it. I'm quite concerned because, the sin most condemned in the scriptures is idolatry. And I was deeply disturbed when I first went to Eastern Europe to see, for example, in Romania, the Communist Party General Secretary, Nicolae Ceausescu, became the focal point of emperor worship to the extent that they composed 8,000 hymns of praise to Nicolae Ceausescu, which the poor children had to sing in the morning before school. And they had his picture everywhere, literally every home, every church. Every building had, even the Bible study, had to have a picture of Nicolae Ceausescu there. And it was nauseating. Now, it's not just them. Of course, we know the chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was elevated to cult status, Vladimir Lenin. Well, his tomb continued to be a site of pilgrimage for over 70 years. And the people literally going to see this pyramid-type structure based on an Egyptian-type tomb, which reminds one of the worship of the pharaohs. And this was for the cult of the chairman, which reached tremendous heights under Joseph Stalin. And every May Day, the communists would have the Red Army march past on Red Square, while the Politburo of the Soviet Union stood above the bones of Lenin on the promenade specifically constructed by this Egyptian-style tomb on Red Square. It is very, very obvious, nauseating. But, we shouldn't sit in the West and say, well, we don't have idols. Well, think of sports idols, sex idols, pop idols, rock idols, Hollywood idols. We've even got programs called idols. So it's not like the West doesn't know what idolatry is. We've got our idols, and it's disturbing. And I'm not just picking on Nelson Mandela. I was disturbed when I spoke in 1997 about how there was a cult of Diana. Now, Diana was one of the goddesses worshipped in the time of the Book of Acts. And in fact, the Apostle Paul had to speak out against this cult of Diana. And there was a riot against it because the people would be chanting, great is Diana, and so on and so forth. And they were absolutely worked up that he was questioning their idol worship industry. And the 1997, those who were alive at the time and saw the outpouring worldwide of irrational grief from people who never knew the princess. And obviously she was beloved in England, and it went beyond it, though. I got the impression there was more idolatry for and concern for Diana's death than it was for Christ's death at the Good Friday services, for example, that particular year. And it just is disturbing when we lift any human being, all of which we are guilty sinners, worthy of an eternity in hell. And if we are saved at all, it's by the grace of God alone, the base of Christ's atonement alone. And so to lift up mere mortal man in the light of the depravity of man and the holiness of God, it's an affront to God. And so idolatry is deeply disturbing. And for example, while we've homeschooled our children, for a limited time when my wife was battling cancer, I put my two boys into an independent Christian school, which I didn't realize how unindependent this independent school was until my son came home with, we have to sing Happy Birthday to Mandela on his birthday so that they can enter the Guinness Book of Records, the man who's had the most people sing Happy Birthday to him on his birthday. And schools were required to do this. And they had to fill out birthday cards, and then they had to write a tribute to Nelson Mandela. And I thought, this is ridiculous. I went to see the principal, and I said, can you think of any free country in the world, I mean, excluding communist dictatorships like North Korea and Cuba, where all the children can be required to praise a political figure? And the principal seemed a bit confused. I said, well, let me put it this way. I think Margaret Thatcher is the finest prime minister in the last century of Great Britain, but I don't think it would be reasonable to expect every child in Great Britain to write a praise for Margaret Thatcher, because not all of their families would agree with her policies, good as I think those policies were personally. Similarly, I think Ronald Reagan was the best president in America's history. Would it be reasonable to expect every American child to write hymns of praise to, or eulogies to Ronald Reagan? Some of the people avidly opposed his free market principles and support socialism, for example. I think the finest leader the country I grew up in was Ian Smith. But I wouldn't think it reasonable to expect everyone in Zimbabwe to have to agree with me on that. So how on earth can you require your children to do all these praises for Mandela? I said, this is a political leader. And she said, but why wouldn't you want to support him? I said, well, we're Christians. And he was not. In fact, he stopped Bible study and prayer, not only in schools, but in Parliament. He legalized abortion. Since then, well, today's date, it's 1.7 million children have been killed by abortion legally. As a pro-life Christian, can you expect me to agree to praising someone who legalized abortion? He effectively legalized prostitution, pornography, and gambling. and Sabbath desecration. Need I go on? There's a lot of reasons why, for ethical reasons, you would want to oppose what Nelson Mandela did. And it doesn't mean that we mean ill for him or we don't want the best for him. But the fact is, we don't agree with his policies nor with his lifestyle. I mean, let's face it, even his own eldest daughter declared in 1994, neither I nor any of my siblings would ever vote for our father because of how he abused our mom and abandoned us as children. And now that was, I noticed that they were all around when he was dying because where there's an inheritance, there's relatives. But when it came to him running for elections, his own children said they wouldn't vote for him. So, that's people who knew him. I didn't know him. I'd only met him for an hour and prayed with him, shared the gospel with him, of course, and gave him clearly why I disagreed with his policies. But while I prayed with him, and I have prayed for him, and I shared the gospel with him, and I gave biblical, rational reasons why his policies were wrong, I don't mean ill for him, but I don't believe in elevating any human being to a position which only our Creator and Eternal Judge should have.
Absolutely, yeah. But so now many people say, but he at least ended apartheid. So that's at least a good thing in his favour.
Well, interestingly enough, we've just had published Under Fire in South Africa by Colonel Skalk Vaskaki of South African Police, who is also a bodyguard for P.W. Botha and became a son-in-law later. And Skalk Vaskaki documents how P.W. Botha, when he met with Mandela, who then was president, Mandela was president, P.W. Botha was then retired. One of the first things that Nelson Mandela said to P.W. Botha was, I get the credit for abolishing apartheid, but actually you're the one who should get the credit because you're the one who actually dismantled apartheid. Sure. And that's what President Nelson Mandela said to ex-President P.W. Botha. And I think that is valid because consider the fact that, in fact, I could quote from my good friend Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi. Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, who's the traditional prime minister of the King of the Zulus, King Goodwill Zwelithini, and Mangosuthu Buthelezi is also the founder of the Inkatha Freedom Party. In fact, he's a real political veteran. He's in his 80s. He's one of only 2 leaders whose face is still on the ballot and has been consistently since 1994 because he's still the leader of the Inkatha Freedom Party. Everyone else's party leaders have changed over and over. Just the ACDP's leader and Inkatha's are the only 2 people who were running also in 94. Interesting. So Mangosuthu Buthelezi has said, how can Nelson Mandela get the credit for ending apartheid? He wasn't able to do anything to end apartheid. He was in prison. It was people like Mangosuthu Buthelezi who were campaigning for ending it through negotiations and peaceful means, and it was people like P.W. Botha as president who actually did the dismantling of apartheid from 1983 when South African white voters voted in 1983 in a referendum, and I remember it because I voted yes in that referendum too, 1983, to dismantle apartheid. Apartheid was being dismantled nationally from 83. In the Cape, it started being dismantled already from the mid-70s. The Navy abolished apartheid in 1974, the police in about 1976, the Army, certainly before I went in 79, because when I went in there were integrated units like 3-2 Battalion and so on, and same uniform, same rank structure, same pay scales, often in the same trench. And so the Army got rid of apartheid long before. Cape Town had dismantled apartheid already in the 70s, starting with Sea Point, swimming pool and all the rest. So Mandela had nothing to do with all that. In fact, as Mangosuthu Buthelezi points out, far from Mandela having anything to do with ending apartheid, he delayed its dismantling by decades, because by starting and launching the armed struggle, the landmine planting, limpet mine planting, bombs in shopping centres and Johannesburg railway station bomb and so on, which incinerated a grandmother and her grandchild in this firebomb that was in a suitcase placed right by this grandmother and her daughter, absolutely hideous. And all these sort of things, that created a backlash, so that instead of South Africa reforming with the times, there was a circling of the wagons, Suppression of Communism Act, Internal Security Act, and all the things that, because of fighting against terrorism, it delayed political reform, which actually was the goal. The Southern Communist Party and the African National Congress had the goal of provoking reaction and delaying reform. That's why they targeted, in many cases, black town councillors, black mayors, black candidates for the provincial legislatures, which became the independent homelands such as Ciskei, Transkei, Venda, and Bophuthatswana, that these leaders were being murdered by ANC cadres and terrorists, including people like Bartholomew Klopani, who was murdered in 1982 by ANC cadres, and his daughter, Pansy Shlopani, I travelled with her to Germany. She is in a wheelchair, 18 years old, in a wheelchair, paralysed from the same assassins who had murdered her parents on that same attack. She was paralysed from the neck down.
Sure.
And so these attacks on elected black representatives on the municipal and provincial level, and even going on to the independent states such as Transkei and Ciskei, all of this was designed to slow down the pace of reform, to create revolution, because this is always the choice: reformation or revolution. That's the goal. So if somebody says, well, at least Mandela ended apartheid, we've got people like Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi and Mandela himself who said, well, actually, I wasn't the one who ended apartheid. That was done by P.W. Botha. And in fact, others have acknowledged that Mangosuthu Buthelezi from the black leader side did far more to bring about reform by working within the system, legally, orderly, through the judicial systems, than anybody who was planting bombs. So you have to be a Marxist revolutionary or ill-informed to think that violent revolutionary does anything good. Yeah. Because, in fact, that's evolutionary politics. It's the idea that, well, the whole world came about because of a Big Bang. So if you can just burn enough things down, blow enough things up, then utopia is going to come out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But isn't that one of the communist tricks they always have in their deck of causing problems, taking a few steps back in order for them to then be able to take their next step forward in the direction that they wanted to go?
Yes, this is the Marxist dialectic. You've got thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So you have the revolutionary does an action because he wants the counter-revolutionary to do a counter-action, which is what he wanted to bring about the synthesis. So it's an indirect way of getting what you want. So you, for example, want to portray the government as oppressive. But nobody believes it's oppressive because, we've never had it so good. And in fact, the communist countries across the border really, really are bad. And we've got people pouring in from Mozambique, from the Congo, from Tanzania, from Zambia, from all over. They're coming in South Africa. Black people are coming in South Africa by the millions under apartheid because they knew they had a better life and a higher standard of living and better medical care and all the rest here than they could get in their free, independent, black ruled countries. And so what do you do to make the people feel oppressed? Well, you throw bombs, you assassinate people, you murder policemen, you murder elected town councillors, and after a while up come the roadblocks, house-to-house searches, more of a military presence. People feel more and more that their freedoms are being infringed upon. You do even more riots, more violence, stoning of cars, more bombs, and before you know it, you've got state of emergency declared. And this is what they wanted. They wanted the government to react so that they could then depict them as oppressors, so that later on they could say, you see, we freed you from all this. But they created the revolution, which created the counter-revolutionary methods, which led to, so it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. This is the Marxist dialectic.
Sure. So does that mean you are then were for apartheid?
No, in fact, anyone can go into our writings, and when apartheid was the ruling ideology of the day, my opposition to it was clear, it was vocal, it was written. You can look at books like Renaissance or Reformation, South Africa Renaissance or Reformation. And in fact, our mission at the time, I got visits back in the early 1980s from security police, National Intelligence Service, military intelligence. Are you a communist? Are you a revolutionary? And so on. Because why are you going into Mozambique and Angola? What were you doing in the ANC offices in Harare? What are you doing in SWAPO base up there in Harare in Zimbabwe? And why are you in these Philima camps? And so they didn't understand what we were doing, and we were viewed with suspicion because we were a mission to persecuted churches. We're going into violent areas, frontline states, communist countries, evangelizing communists. And because I'd been communist bases, of course, showing the Jesus film, distributing Bibles, evangelizing, baptizing even, I was viewed with great suspicion by people on the side. In fact, one of the very first frontline camps we ever held, it was at Pinkster Park outside Somerset West, and the RKS base there, that campsite, we had it for our campsite. And on the first night, Friday night, I had the caretaker come say, I'm so sorry, but I didn't know you'd have those people with you. You'll have to ask them to leave. And what people? Well, turned out to be the knee blinkers. Okay, so, all right, we'll leave, I said. So he said, no, you can stay. Julle mag bly. Hulle moet weg. They must go. So I said, no, if some of us go, we all go. So we were actually turfed out of our first campsite. Now I'm going back to 1984. And that was plainly because we were a multiracial mission in a time when that wasn't the in thing. I chose not to study at the White Theological College of the Baptist up in Johannesburg, which would be where you'd normally go. I chose to go to the coloured Baptist Theological College in Cape Town because I'm training for missions. What's the point training amongst just the same culture? I need to be involved in a cross-cultural situation because I'm going to have a life in mission. So at that time, that was considered subversive and questionable, and I had people questioning me on that very purpose. I mean, security policemen would come and see me to find out why you're doing this. And in fact, at the time, even the high school where I matriculated from, Pounds High School, the principal told me the security police arrived there wanting to see all of my English essays, history essays, exam results, and so on from 1977 where I matriculated, because they were investigating me because I was a suspected communist, because of what I was doing at that time. And I was spending so much time in black and coloured townships, as they called them. And for this reason, at that stage of racial animosity, terrorism, violence, they investigated me as a potential security threat. And so, no, I certainly spoke out against racial segregation and these petty apartheid laws at the time. I did think separate development, where people vote for themselves and the independence of Transvaal and Siska, I thought that was a great idea. That's what Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Croatia want, independence, to let the Zulus run Zululand, to let the Xhosas run Transvaal. I thought that idea of self-determination of peoples was a great idea, and I certainly support that. But petty apartheid, kicking people off buses for not being in the back of the bus, that sort of petty nonsense I never supported. But it takes no courage to kick a dead dog. And now that apartheid is no longer the ruling ideology of the country, you've got all these people crawling out the woodworks who probably were completely complicit with it at the time, who now can run out there and kick the dead dog, but they weren't willing to speak out against it or fight it effectively when it was the ruling ideology. Now, I've noticed in the past, if you opposed apartheid, you could be accused of being a communist back then. Today, if you oppose the ANC government, you're a racist. You're pro-apartheid. And so this is cheap character assassination. The fact is, we should be able to question things, and iron should sharpen iron, and we shouldn't be having our motives questioned just because we brought some facts up. And so for me to say, I'm pro-life and I oppose abortion, shouldn't have somebody shout, you're only saying that because you're racist. Well, that's not a very intelligent way of having a discussion, is it?
Yes, absolutely. So, as you say, like, all of this has happened in the past, and it was easy to forget about it when it was happening, but now that it's happened, people still remember it and discuss it and whatnot, as we see with all these revolutionary anniversaries, how people still commemorate these historic events. But how do they still actually affect us today?
Well, it does affect us, because honestly, what you build your calendar around speaks volumes about your worldview and your religion. So a Christian will build their worldview, the calendar to start with, the incarnation of Christ. It's right that Christmas is the biggest holiday of the year, because this is a major, major event. God with us. God has come to this world, been born amongst us. This is the incarnation is super important. Good Friday should be a major holiday, because we remember the most solemn, serious day of atonement when Christ died for our sins. Resurrection Sunday should be one of the biggest holidays of the year, because we celebrate a risen Savior. He is risen from death, hell, and the grave, victorious. And he's ascended in high, so the ascension is super important. It should be a public holiday. Pentecost Sunday, Reformation Day, calling people back to the Bible. So I think Christian calendars are important. So what do you say when you see your calendar moving to Youth Day, Women's Day, Workers' Day, which is May Day, which is actually a communist holiday? When that May Day, 1st of May, was when the Red Army would march past Lenin's bones in the Red Square. And it's also a human sacrifice day in Satanist calendar, as is Halloween, 31 October. So you can see that a lot of our holidays have now moved into a secular humanist direction. And it's more serious than one thinks, because along with that has come kicking the Bible and prayer out of schools, bringing in situation ethics and gender confusion studies, and the whole LGBTQ, gay GB, pink Inquisition agenda, and evolutionism, and you all came from nothing, and you're going nowhere, and life is meaningless, and a whole lot of time and a whole lot of nothing made everything, and nothing's exactly right or wrong, and it's all situation ethics. So all of these things have come in, and what's the result? Legalized abortion, legalized pornography, legalized effectively prostitution, gambling, desecration of the Sabbath. A whole lot of evils have come in, and now you could get into more trouble for defending yourself against crime than being a criminal. And these standards seem to be inverted. People are less safe. Your life expectancy is more damaged. The most vulnerable, innocent citizens of all, preborn babies, have no rights, it seems, in the womb. So, yes, I see right now a war on fathers, a war on femininity, a war on the marriage, war on family, war on God, effectively. So, yes, this is deeply disturbing, and we need to, as Christians, recognize we're in a spiritual world war. We've got clearly before, especially at this time of the year, revolution or reformation. You follow the world or you follow the word of God. It's Christ to Antichrist. This is really what it's getting down to.
Yeah, sure. So then what is exactly the difference between Reformation and Revolution?
Well, the revolutionaries want to use violence, and Reformation uses regeneration. We're trying to get people back to the Bible, back to getting right with God and therefore right with man. So at the heart of the Christian message is to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love our neighbor as ourselves. And loving our neighbor as ourselves includes loving my preborn neighbor and seeking to protect him from the violence of abortion, loving enough to want to protect my young neighbor from the violence and exploitation of pornography, wanting to protect my neighbor from all the results of situation ethics, which takes away all the meaning and purpose of life, and to bring people back to the Word of God. So we believe in regeneration, seeking first the kingdom of God, loving our neighbors ourselves, doing to others we want to be done unto. All of this is part of Reformation. What does the revolution say? Demand your rights. And funny, when I'm demanding my rights, I'm often stepping over the rights of somebody else. And it's often throw rocks, block roads, block traffic, down tools, stayaways, strikes, which gets in the way of
behead people, drown people.
Things like all of which undermines the economy, destroys other people's lives and businesses, devalues the rand currency, chases away investors, chases away job creators, creates more unemployment, more misery, more suffering, and a lot of victims of crime. So I think the fruit is quite clear. And in the Bible, it's very clear. You're either for me or you're against me, Jesus. Choose you this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord, said Joshua.
So I think people often view revolutions as an oppressed people that are trying to, as you say, stand up for their rights and trying to bring about change in their society. Is there any examples in history of a successful revolution where this has happened?
I do not believe so. And I've been studying history for a long time. I'm 59 years old now. I've been a Christian for the last 42 years. I do not know of one single revolution which improved the situation for the people. I challenge people to please tell me if they can find a revolution that actually made things better. I mean, just take the Bolshevik Revolution. Everyone wants to make such a big thing about, well, the people are so oppressed, and Tsar Nicholas was so tyrannical and he is so bad, and so Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the communists, had to save Russia from him, and they really improved everyone's life expectancy and so on. Well, none of that is true. Because first of all, Tsar Nicholas II was a reformer. He gave Russia its Duma, its parliament. That's hardly the work of a tyrant. So this narrative, this popular myth that Lenin and the Bolshevik revolutionaries overthrew the Tsar of Russia, it makes a nice story, but the facts ruin it, because it was the Duma of Russia, the parliament, that requested the king's abdication. And Tsar Nicholas abdicated or resigned on the request or pressure of his parliament, which immediately disproves this whole legend that, he was the sole despotic ruler and there was no rights and there's no checks and balances and there was no other law except... What was that Parliament doing there? And by the way, who established the Parliament and gave them that power? Well, the Tsar did. So it's so much nonsense that I think a lot of what you've got now is to justify the Bolshevik, Marxist, revolutionary atrocities, which, by the way, killed tens of millions of people. I mean, just read the Black Book of Communism, which documents from the communists' own records 100 million people killed in the 20th century, just between 1917 and 1991 when the Soviet Union ended. 100 million people killed by their own records. Now, honestly, just to give you a bit of a balance, the Tsar, who was so oppressive, he had a secret police of a couple of hundred. Lenin, who was so peaceful, he had only a few 100,000 secret police. Stalin had a few million. It went up to 3 million secret police, part of the KGB. Sure. Executions under the Tsar throughout the entire vast empire, which covers something like 9 time zones. The Tsar had about 65 people executed a year. Now that was murderers, rapists, arsonists, revolutionaries, bad people. Capital punishment. 60 to 62 people a year on average executed. Under Lenin, the executions went to the hundreds of thousands a year. Under Stalin, it went to the millions a year murdered. Now, how's that for liberation? So when people try to act that the Tsars were oppressive, I say, nonsense. It's the commissars who were oppressive. The Tsar, the one Tsar, was a reformer who was giving the people more rights and raising the standards of living dramatically. Under Tsar Nicholas II, there was tremendous increase in life expectancy, productivity, income. He was really improving their lives. It was the First World War which destroyed many people's lives and livelihood. And that, of course, was wicked, bad, and he was ill-advised to get into that war. But the reign of the Tsar was generally very positive and very much on the upturn. But the commissars, they destroyed Russia and turned the Soviet Union to a byword of evil. And you can tell it because they needed 1,200 concentration camps, which chewed up the lives of 50 million people. Sure. Just in the concentration camps. Read the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn if you just want insight into that, or One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is another Solzhenitsyn classic. But this is the problem. All revolutionaries, whether you talk about the French Revolution, Zimbabwe's revolution, the Cambodian revolution under Pol Pot, Mengistu's revolution in Ethiopia, Castro's revolution in Cuba, Mao Zedong's in China, every single revolution without exception makes life immeasurably worse for the people than what was before.
Sure. So the only people that end up actually benefiting are the people promising the liberty who actually didn't need it in the first place. And all the people that did need it end up even worse off than they started.
Yes, but actually, even that needs a caveat. Because as was well documented in Animal Farm by George Orwell, who used to be a communist himself and who modeled it on the Soviet Revolution. Interesting, the book Animal Farm came out in 1945 and it was so unpopular in Britain because the British people were outraged. They immediately knew, you're making this Animal Farm on Russia, and Russia's been our ally in the last war. Funnily enough, it found its greatest receptivity in Eastern Europe and Russia, of course, underground press, illegal, totally. And I found the same in Angola. The people loved the Animal Farm because they recognized this is the revolution. Yeah. Now, in it, he marks the head of the revolution as Snowball, whom he modeled on Trotsky, who later gets run out of the farm and out of the country and gets axed, literally pickaxed in Mexico City by the NKVD, by Napoleon, who had nothing to do with the revolution, but he took over power afterwards. And that's modeled, of course, on Stalin. And so Trotsky did the fighting. Trotsky was the head of the Red Army. Trotsky was the revolutionary, actually risked his life and fought. Evil man though he was, obviously, brutal mass murderer. But this nothing lowlife who used to just rob banks, Stalin, he now becomes the dictator. But he had nothing to do with the actual revolution. And, he pins on himself the star of Lenin, but he wasn't actually one of the people who fought for it. Typical. But so right down to that sort of fine detail, the people in Eastern Europe loved Animal Farm, but the people in England disdained it because they thought it was slandering the wonderful revolution of Russia. Just shows how times change. 1984 also makes it clear, also written by George Orwell, how these revolutions are pretty cannibalistic. And Robespierre, written by Otto Scott, documents how every one of the revolutionaries, ended up in the same guillotine that they'd condemned so many others to, because revolution has become cannibalistic, and they end up killing their own. And Stalin and the Great Purges ended up killing just about every single revolutionary who had brought about the Soviet Revolution, because he knew he couldn't trust them.
Absolutely.
People who've overthrown one oppressor are likely to overthrow you when you become an oppressor. And so, in fact, if the EFF and others on the ground as the vanguard of the revolution understood how revolutions worked, they'd understand that they'd just been used as cannon fodder for cynical people after power, and they might be the first ones for the chop if the revolution succeeds.
Yeah, sure. And it all, as you said earlier, just ends up linking back to your underlying beliefs and worldview. Because if you believe in Reformation and stand for Reformation, then it's God-centered and it's creation-centered, and love for your neighbor, love ultimately for God and then for your neighbor. Whereas if it's revolution centered, then it's all about greed. It's all about how I can get power, how I can get money. And as you say, your worldview is evolution, and so you create chaos, and out of it will come a utopia. And so you can definitely see how their underlying worldview believes what they stand for. So
yes, as R.J. Rustrini says, everyone acts consistent with their beliefs. He may say, but I know a lot of people are not consistent. So, they may not act consistent with their profession, but they act consistent with what their real beliefs are. For example, if somebody runs in here and says, your car's being stolen or your house is on fire, you don't just say, I believe you, and stay seated. If you believe the person, you'd get up and do something about it. And so a person says, well, I believe the Bible, I believe Jesus, but he doesn't obey him. He doesn't really believe. And so it may be that a person says, well, I believe in communism, but if they don't act consistent with it, they don't really believe it, they're just professing it.
Yeah.
So yes, your worldview has a huge, major impact on every single area. And that's why we think investing in biblical worldview summits are so important. That's why our Reformation studies are so important, to know our history. That's why we've been producing not just great books, but also videos. And so if somebody wants some documentation on what I've said about Mandela Day, the making of new religion, that's actually a video on our website. You can find it on our Vimeo page. Also, we've got the audio on our sermon audio page, different lectures of these, including on the French Revolution and on Mandela and so on. So if you would like to see more, there's a PowerPoint on our slideshow too. So go on to Frontline-Episode.org, look at the video and audio pages, and look under history or political and revolution. You'll see a whole range of these different lectures in audio form, video form, or in PowerPoint form, whichever you prefer. And there's often articles on, especially Reformation.sa.org, that's got a lot of the actual text of the lectures and the articles. So if you want documentation, when you get to the end of one article, like Mandela Day and the making of a new religion, you'll see links to idolatry is the most condemned sin in the Bible, which is also in sermon audio, and mass marketing, the Mandela myth, and the Mandela industry. These are different articles I've written on different Mandela days to, it's part of my 67 minutes that I've contributed.
Wonderful. So last question for you then is, how do we then work for Reformation? What is the solution to all of this?
Yes, well, at this moment, we are actually at the beginning of a Coalition Revival Global Reformation Conference live stream. So every day broadcast from 2 in the afternoon, South Africa time, so 12 noon Greenwich Mean Time, from Monday, started yesterday, through to Saturday, the 20th of July. We are having broadcasts and interaction dealing with different issues of Reformation, including examples of excellence like Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, and what we can do, and everything from Wittenberg at Stadtkirchen and in the Schlosskirche, where Luther nailed his 95 Theses, through to the oldest Protestant church in the Southern Hemisphere, Strand Street Lutheran Church, and the Euro Choir, International Choir singing. So there's a whole lot of good things dealing with what we can do. But I'd say one of the first things we do if we want to work for Reformation is get back to reading the Bible. If you read 4 chapters a day, you'll get through a whole Bible in a year. If you want to revive your prayer life, start praying through the book of Psalms. 150 Psalms. There's your next 5 months' prayers organized. Pray your way through each one of the 150 Psalms. 1 Psalm a day. That is tremendous. You want wisdom? Start reading your way through Proverbs. 31 chapters of Proverbs. one for every day of the month. And so we need wisdom, we need Proverbs, we need worship, we need Psalms. We need to have examples of excellence. Well, tune into our From the Front Lines or into the Coalition Revival Reformation conference right now, or get onto our website and see some of the presentations in video format or audio, whatever is more suitable to your lifestyle. And you'll see some great examples of what to do, including how you can start a Reformation Society. Also on a whole lot of films that we recommend, history films, Reformation films, a lot of which are online. So what can we do to work for Reformation? We want to get people back to the Bible. Join your local Bible study group or start one if there isn't one in your school or home or area.
Absolutely, because at the end of the day, the heart of the problem is the problem of the heart. And so people are acting in this way because of we have an evil heart. And so we can't force them to be moral by changing the laws or anything else. It's the heart that's the problem. And so it's only the Lord Jesus Christ that can change their heart. So we need to, as you say, get back to the word, pray for the lost, share the good news of the gospel with the lost. And once the people's hearts start changing, we'll then see a heart in the nation.
Martin Luther, nearly 500 years ago, said, if I profess with the loudest voice and the clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that point which the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, then I'm not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing him. For where the battle rages, there the loyalty of the soldiers proved, and to be steady on all the battlefront besides is mere flight and disgrace if he flinches at that point. So it is absolutely vital for us to be responding to the many challenges of our age with Christian clarity and with biblical faithfulness, and I believe the choice before us is very clear.
Absolutely. And as you said earlier, that people always they act on what they believe, and even though many people in South Africa might believe the Bible and they might believe in God, they've also unfortunately swallowed all the lies that have been given to us in our education system, in the media, and all of that. And so that's why it's so important to get back to the truth, to get back to the Bible, to support journalists and free media stations and that type of thing, so that we can know what the truth is and we can act on the truth and what we believe in that. So let's get back to the word. Let's surrender ourselves to God. And it says in Psalm 118 that it's better to trust in the Lord than it is to put our confidence in man. Thank you very much, Dr. Hammond. Good evening.